The pouring rain and flickering motel lights triggered veteran Nick Lawson's panic attack. He was nearly paralyzed, fighting for breath. Diesel, his gray and white service dog, was already performing his task, pressing firmly into Nick's hand to ground him. But in the next second, Diesel's behavior changed completely. He ignored his handler's panic. He let out a sharp, decisive bark, lunging toward the glass. He had seen what Nick, lost in his own storm, had missed. Under the buzzing light, a man was throwing a mother's and her little girl's belongings onto the pavement, ignoring their desperate cries in the storm. Nick was a man trying to hide from the world, but his companion had just forced him to make a choice he could not escape. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. The rain in this part of Washington was not a gentle thing. It was a cold, persistent liquid curtain that fell from a sky the color of wet concrete. It was the sound that defined Nick Lawson's life. The steady, rhythmic thump of the windshield wipers was the percussion to his quiet existence. Nick drove his old pickup truck, the engine a low rumble beneath his feet. He was a man who looked older than his 40-odd years, with a tall, slightly gaunt frame that still held the disciplined strength of his past. His face was rugged, carved by wind and memory, but his eyes, clear and deep-set, held a stubborn kindness. His brown hair was a little longer than regulation, a habit he had never broken, and was marked by the first frost of gray at his temples. He wore his uniform, a worn flannel shirt, its pattern of faded red, dark navy, and off-white, muted by time, left unbuttoned over a simple gray t-shirt. It was the same outfit he had worn to his appointment at the VA hospital. Beside him, filling the passenger seat with a quiet dignity, sat Diesel. Diesel was a German shepherd, but not the common black and tan. His coat was a striking, rare, pale gray and white, like a winter wolf. At 8 years old, he was in his prime, a 100-pound presence of steadfast loyalty. He was not a pet. He was an anchor. Diesel was Nick's service dog, a four-legged ballast against the storm inside Nick's head. The trip to the VA always left Nick unmoored. He drove through the blurred, neon-slick streets of the industrial town, his mind replaying the polite, clinical words of Dr. Jordan King. Grounding techniques, present-moment awareness. Nick gripped the steering wheel. The doctor meant well, but he did not understand. The only grounding technique that truly worked was currently breathing softly beside him. As they neared the edge of town, a flickering, broken neon sign cut through the deluge. The vacancy sign of the Wayside Motel buzzed and spat, casting a sick, flickering pink glow over the wet asphalt. It was the flicker that did it, the rhythmic, broken light, the sound of the rain turning to static. The air in the cab felt too thick. Nick's breathing hitched, the simple in and out, suddenly a complex task he had forgotten how to perform. The thump-thump of the wipers was no longer just the wipers, it was the distant, rhythmic percussion of something he tried to forget every second of every day. His hands clamped onto the steering wheel, his knuckles white. Before the tremor in his hands could take full hold, Diesel acted. The big shepherd, who had been resting his head, lifted it. He did not bark or whine. He simply let out a low, almost silent huff of air through his nose, a sound of profound presence. Then, with practiced, gentle force, he pressed his heavy head firmly onto Nick's thigh. The pressure was immediate, solid, real. It was an anchor dropped into a turbulent sea. Nick's lungs unlocked, and he let out the breath he was holding in a shuddering gasp. He turned his hand over, his fingers finding the familiar soft fur behind Diesel's ear. "Right," Nick whispered, his voice rough. "I'm here. Thanks, buddy." He was here. He was not there. He was in his truck, in the rain, in Washington. As the knot in his chest loosened, Diesel lifted his head, his duty done. But then the dog's posture changed. Diesel's ears snapped forward, two gray triangles rigid with focus. His body, which had been relaxed, went taut. He stared intently through the streaming windshield. A low rumble, barely audible, started in his deep chest. "What is it?" Nick said, his own senses suddenly on high alert, the fog of his past replaced by the sharp focus of the present. Diesel did not look at him. He let out a single, sharp, heavy bark. It was not an alarm of panic, but a demand. Look, Nick followed the dog's gaze, and his world stopped for a different reason. On the pavement just outside the small, bright square of the motel's office, a scene was unfolding. Under the weak yellow porch light, piles of belongings sat in the driving rain. A child's mattress, dark with moisture. Black trash bags that had split, spilling clothes. A sodden cardboard box of toys. A man, Reed Porter, the heavy-set owner of the motel, whom Nick recognized from a distance, stood under the small awning, his face a mask of irritation. He was shouting something, his words snatched by the wind, at a woman. She was thin, her jacket soaked through, her dark hair plastered to her face. She was trying to shield a small child, a little girl who was clutching a bedraggled teddy bear. "I told you," Reed Porter's voice rose above the storm. "Checkout was 11 a.m. I'm not running a charity." The woman, Nora, said something Nick could not hear, her voice desperate. But it was the child's cry that cut through the glass, a high, thin sound of pure misery that lanced straight into Nick's chest. And just like that, he was frozen again. The man shouting, the woman's desperation, the girl's cry. It was all too much. It was chaos. It was helplessness. Nick's world compressed, the rain on the windshield the only thing in focus. The static of his past roared back, threatening to swallow him. He was paralyzed, a spectator to a disaster he had no right to interrupt, no strength to fix. His hands were locked on the wheel, his heart hammering against his ribs. He couldn't move. Diesel beside him did nothing. He did not bark again. He did not move. He simply sat, a solid, breathing presence of total unnerving calm. He looked at the scene, then he turned his intelligent, pale eyes to Nick. He did not nudge him. He simply waited. His steadiness was an accusation. It was a command. "You are in control. Act." It was the dog's absolute calm, his unwavering confidence in his handler, that finally broke the spell. The ice in Nick's veins cracked. The paralysis receded, replaced by a cold, familiar resolve. He put the truck in park. The heavy clunk of the gear shift was the loudest sound he had ever heard. "Okay," he said, this time to the dog and to himself. "Okay." The truck door opened with a metallic groan, and Nick Lawson unfolded himself into the storm. The rain hit him instantly, cold and hard. He ignored Reed Porter. He ignored the man's sputtering excuses as he saw Nick approaching, a tall, silent figure emerging from the dark. Nick walked directly to the woman. She flinched when she saw him, pulling her daughter closer. "Ma'am," Nick said, his voice low and steady, a gravelly sound that carried easily over the rain. He did not have to shout. "Ma'am, get your daughter. Get in my truck." Nora stared at him, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. "What?" "Get in the truck. It's warm. You're not safe out here." I can't," she stammered, looking back at her pile of soaked belongings. You can sort that later," Nick said, his tone softening slightly, but losing none of its authority. He looked at the little girl, Jessica, who was shivering so hard her teeth were chattering. He took a step back toward his truck and opened the passenger door. The cab light clicked on, illuminating Diesel, who sat patiently, his gaze fixed on the little girl. Jessica saw the big dog, and her eyes went even wider. She buried her face in her mother's coat. Diesel, sensing the girl's fear, did something remarkable. He let out a soft whine, a sound completely at odds with his imposing size, and lowered his head, his ears flattening in a gesture of gentle submission. That was all it took. "It's okay," Nora whispered to her daughter, though she was clearly telling herself. It's okay." She grabbed Jessica's small hand. "Thank you," she said to Nick, a raw, broken whisper. Nick just nodded, his face unreadable in the dark. "Get in." He helped them up into the cab, Nora sliding in first, pulling Jessica onto her lap. The little girl stared at Diesel, who simply watched them with quiet intensity. Nick shut the door, sealing them inside, a tiny temporary island of warmth. He turned back to Reed Porter, who was still standing under the light, looking suddenly uncertain. Nick Lawson did not say a word. He just looked at the man, his gaze flat and cold. Then he walked back to the driver's side, climbed in, and put the truck in gear. The wipers resumed their steady beat as they pulled away from the wayside motel, leaving the flickering sign and the soaked remains of a life behind them. The drive to Nick's house took 8 minutes. It was the longest 8 minutes of Nora's life. The journey was silent, broken only by the rhythmic thump-swish of the windshield wipers and the quiet, hiccuping sobs of her daughter, Jessica. The little girl was burrowed deep into Nora's lap, her small fingers twisting in the fabric of Nora's soaked jacket. Nora, for her part, sat rigid, staring straight ahead. She was in a stranger's truck, a man who had appeared out of the rain like a ghost, with a dog that looked more like a wolf. She had no choice. She knew that, but every second her mind screamed at her. What have you done? What new danger have you put her in? Nick's house was a small, pre-war bungalow on a quiet, tree-lined street at the edge of town. It was modest, with a tidy yard that was invisible in the dark and a single, welcoming yellow light shining from the porch. Nick pulled into the short driveway and killed the engine. The sudden silence was deafening, amplifying the sound of the rain drumming on the truck's roof. For a long moment, no one moved. Nick sat with his hands on the steering wheel, his jaw tight. This was it. The barrier was about to be broken. His home was not just a house, it was a fortress. It was the one place on earth where the walls did not close in, where the shadows stayed in the corners, and where he was in complete control. Dr. Jordan King was always talking about safe zones, and this house was Nick's. He had built it, fortified it not with locks and alarms, but with routine, solitude, and silence. Now he was about to violate his own most sacred rule. He could feel the anxiety building, a familiar, cold pressure in his chest. His breathing was too shallow. The air in the cab, now filled with the foreign scent of wet wool and another person's fear, felt suffocating. Diesel, sensing the shift in his handler, let out a low, almost imperceptible whine. It was the sound of a spring tightening. Nick took a breath. He forced it. "We're here. Let's get you inside." He got out and moved with the quick, efficient motions of a man who hated wasted effort. He opened her door, and Nora practically fell out, her legs stiff and cold. She pulled Jessica out, the girl's small, soaked sneakers hitting the pavement with a squelch. "This way." He unlocked his front door and pushed it open, stepping aside. He did not step in first. He was not welcoming them. He was admitting them. Nora hesitated on the threshold, a dark shape against the rain. We're dripping everywhere." "Just get in," Nick said, his voice rougher than he intended. She flinched but obeyed, stepping over the threshold onto the small welcome mat. Jessica clung to her leg, her face hidden. Nick shut the door. The sound of the deadbolt sliding home was loud in the small entryway. The immediate sense of violation was overwhelming. His sanctuary was breached. The smell of the rain, the river, and the motel's cheap soap filled his nose. He could feel his pulse hammering in his temples. He needed them gone. He needed to be alone. He needed to wipe down the floor where they were standing. He was clumsy, awkward, his limbs suddenly too long. He just stood there, his keys still in his hand, trying to control the urge to tell them to leave. And then Diesel saved him. The big shepherd had entered with them, his nails making soft click-clack sounds on the hardwood floor. In any other circumstance, Diesel's instinct would have been to guard his handler. He would have placed himself between Nick and the strangers, his body rigid, a low growl of warning ready in his throat. Instead, he did the exact opposite. He completely ignored Nick. He walked past his handler, his movements fluid and calm. Nora saw him approach and let out a small, terrified gasp, pulling Jessica behind her. It's okay, honey," she whispered, her voice trembling. Diesel stopped about 6 feet away from them. He did not bark. He did not bristle. He looked at Nora, then his gaze lowered to the small, trembling girl hiding behind her. He let out a long, slow sigh, the sound of air escaping a bellows, and then he lay down. He flopped onto the small rug in front of the cold fireplace, his head resting on his paws. He was not asleep. His pale gray ears swiveled slightly, but his body was a picture of complete, disarming relaxation. He was not guarding Nick from them. He was, in a strange canine way, welcoming them to his space. He had positioned himself directly in the center of the small living room, a literal bridge of peace lying between the two frightened strangers and the anxious, tense man by the door. Nick watched the entire exchange, and the cold panic in his chest eased, just a fraction. He lived by a code, and that code was built on trust. He did not trust people. He did not trust his own judgment, but he trusted Diesel. He trusted Diesel's instincts more than he trusted the sun to rise. If Diesel, his protector, his shadow, saw no threat, if he was in fact actively submitting to their presence, then there was no threat. The dog's clear, unambiguous acceptance was the only reason Nick did not open the door and tell them to find shelter elsewhere. "Right," Nick said, the single word breaking the tension. He finally moved, hanging his keys on the hook by the door. "Towels. You need towels." He disappeared down a short hallway and returned with 2 faded but clean olive green bath towels. He handed them to Nora, careful not to let their fingers touch. "Thank you," she whispered. Her voice was raw, as if she had been screaming or crying for hours. Now, in the light of the living room, Nick could see her properly. She was younger than he first thought, maybe in her mid-30s. Her dark, wavy hair was plastered to her pale, fine-boned face, but it was her eyes that held him. They were wide and exhausted, but haunted by something deeper than just fear. They were hollowed out by a profound, bone-deep shame. The little girl, Jessica, was a miniature version of her mother, all big, frightened eyes. She clutched a brown teddy bear that was missing an ear and soaked through. "I have a guest room," Nick said, breaking the silence. "It's just a bed and a bathroom. You can—" "We can't pay you," Nora blurted out, her voice cracking. The words tumbled out, driven by a desperate need to be honest. I have nothing." Nick just looked at her. "I didn't ask you to." "But—" She wrapped the towel tighter around Jessica, who had started to shiver violently. I'm so sorry to do this to you. I didn't know where else to go." "What happened?" Nick asked. It was a simple question, direct and without malice. Nora looked away, her gaze falling to the floor. This was the moment. She could tell him the truth, the whole sordid, unbelievable story of betrayal and deceit. But she couldn't. The shame was too much. It was a physical weight in her throat. It was not just about being homeless. It was about why. It was about her failure. It was about the trust she had broken. It was my bank account, she finally whispered, the words tasting like ash. "I went to pay the man, Mr. Porter, and my card wouldn't work." She was rambling, her voice getting higher. "I called the bank. They said it was frozen, all of it, the trust, everything. It was just gone. He said I had until 5 o'clock, but the bank was closed and—" She stopped, a sob catching in her throat. She looked at Jessica, her face crumbling. "I failed her. Oh, I've failed her so badly." She was wrestling with a guilt that went far beyond an empty bank account. She believed she had failed her husband, who was gone. She had failed to protect his legacy. And she had, in turn, failed to protect his daughter. Nick was not a man who understood complex emotions, but he understood failure. He understood guilt. He looked at Diesel, who was watching Nora, his head tilted. "The guest room is down the hall. To the left," Nick said, his voice flat, but not unkind. "There are some old t-shirts and sweatpants in the closet. They're clean. They'll be too big, but they're dry." Nora looked up, shocked. She had expected to be interrogated, or judged, or thrown out. She was met with simple, practical instructions. "Go," Nick said. "Get the girl warm." Nora nodded, unable to speak. She picked up the shivering Jessica, who was now almost asleep on her feet, and whispered, "Thank you. Thank you." She carried her daughter down the hall, a refugee in a foreign land. Nick stood in the living room, listening to the sound of a door clicking shut. The house was quiet again, but it was no longer his. The silence was heavy, filled with the presence of strangers. He looked at Diesel. The big shepherd stood up, stretched, and walked over to Nick, pushing his head firmly into his hand. Nick scrubbed the dog's head, his fingers digging into the thick fur. "What did you get us into, buddy?" he murmured. Diesel just leaned against his leg, a solid, warm anchor in the middle of the storm. The sun rose watery and weak, a pale smear of light behind the uniform gray clouds. The storm had passed in the night, leaving behind a world that felt washed clean and utterly silent, save for the steady drip of water from the eaves of Nick's house. Nick was awake before the light. He was always awake. Sleep was a shallow river he waded in, never a deep ocean he sank into. He sat at his small kitchen table, nursing a mug of black coffee, his movements slow and deliberate. The house was too quiet, yet too loud. He could hear the unfamiliar sound of breathing from the guest room. He could smell the faint foreign scent of Nora's damp clothes, which he had dumped in a pile by the back door, and the cheap soap from the motel. His sanctuary felt contaminated. He had spent the night on the sofa, his mind racing. He was angry at Diesel for forcing the situation, angry at himself for his weakness, and deeply, profoundly anxious about the two strangers sleeping 20 feet away. Every instinct screamed at him to make them leave, to restore the order of his solitude. Diesel was lying at his feet, his head on Nick's boot. The dog was Nick's barometer. This morning, Diesel was not relaxed, but he was not on alert. He was simply waiting. A soft click echoed from the hallway. The guest room door. Nick's entire body tensed. He heard a floorboard creak. Nora appeared at the edge of the kitchen, her form silhouetted by the weak morning light. She was wearing a pair of his old gray sweatpants, rolled up multiple times at the ankle, and a dark blue t-shirt so large it hung on her small frame like a tunic. Her face was pale and puffy from crying, her dark hair tangled from a restless night. Behind her, clinging to the back of the t-shirt, was Jessica. The little girl was also wearing one of his t-shirts, this one an old olive drab color that swallowed her, the sleeves hanging past her fingertips. "Mr. Lawson," Nora began, her voice a low, mortified whisper. I don't know how to thank you. We'll be out of your way. I just need to call someone. As soon as—" "Coffee?" Nick interrupted. His voice was a dull gravel. It was easier to perform a task than to navigate the swamp of her gratitude. "Oh, yes, please?" Nick turned, the simple act of pouring a second mug giving him something to focus on. He pushed the mug across the counter toward her. "My daughter," Nora said, her voice strained. She needs clothes. Our things? They were in the truck? They're soaked?" "By the back door," Nick said, not looking at her. "I brought them in. Didn't want them stolen." "Thank you." She looked at Jessica. "Honey, you stay right there with the dog. I'll be right back." Jessica, who had been hiding, peeked around her mother. Her gaze was fixed on Diesel. The big shepherd, seeing her look, thumped his tail once on the floor. A slow, heavy thump. Nora hurried to the back door and returned a moment later, dragging a large, dark red canvas duffel bag. It was dark with moisture and left a trail of small puddles on the hardwood floor. "I'm so sorry about the floor," she murmured, unzipping the bag. "It's just water," Nick said, turning to lean against the counter, sipping his coffee. He watched, detached, as she began to rummage through the damp, jumbled contents. She pulled out a small pair of jeans and a pink sweatshirt, wincing as she felt how cold and wet they were. She was digging deeper, likely for something, anything that was dry, when a small object, tangled in a wad of socks, was dislodged. It fell from the bag, and its small weight made a quiet metallic sound as it skittered across the wood floor, coming to rest near the leg of the sofa. Nora, exasperated, let out a sigh. "Oh, honestly?" Before she could move to get it, Diesel lifted his head. His ears perked. A new object in his space. He stood up, his claws clicking softly on the floor, and padded over to the small, glinting thing. He sniffed it. Then, with a gentle, curious push of his wet nose, he nudged it. The object slid another inch. "Diesel, leave it," Nick said, his voice quiet. Nora had started to stand up. "I'll get it, it's just—" "I've got it," Nick said, already moving. He was closer. He bent down, his joints stiff, and his fingers closed around the object. He stood up, turning it over in his calloused palm. It was a single, standard-issue military dog tag, the chain long since broken. Nick's mind was blank for a second. It was just a piece of metal. He had seen thousands of them. He had worn his own for years, the metal cold against his skin, until the day he had put them in a drawer and never looked at them again. He turned the tag over to read the debossed text, and the world tilted. His breath snagged in his throat. The coffee mug in his other hand began to tremble, the hot liquid sloshing against the rim. The sound of the refrigerator's hum, the drip of the rain outside, the very air in the room. It all evaporated. He was not in his kitchen in Washington. He was in the dust, the heat pressing in, the sky a painful, blinding blue. He heard a laugh, loud and irreverent, a flash of a grin beneath a layer of sweat and grime. "Come on, Lawson, keep up." He stared at the name. Reeves, Franklin M. He read the service number below it, a number he knew as well as his own. He read the blood type. O-PO-S. Nick's lungs forgot how to work. Is something wrong?" Nora asked. She saw the color drain from his face, saw the stark, terrifying stillness that had seized him. Nick could not answer. He looked up from the tag. His eyes, usually so guarded and distant, were now wide, raw, and blazing with a look of such profound shock that Nora took an involuntary step back. "Where?" he said, and the single word was a broken, choked sound, a rasp of agony. "Where did you get this?" Nora was frightened by his intensity. It was my husband's," she stammered. "It was Frank's. He passed away 2 years ago." Nick's hand closed around the tag, the edges of the metal digging into his palm. "Your husband," he repeated, his voice hollow. Frank Reeves." He said the name as if it were a talisman, a word from a dead language. "Yes," Nora said, her confusion turning to fear. "How did you know his—" "He was my team leader," Nick whispered. The admission hung in the air, heavy and impossible. "He was," Nick's voice cracked, and he fought to control it. "He was my brother?" Nora's hands flew to her mouth, a sharp, choked gasp escaping. "Oh my God, you're Lawson? You're Nick?" Nick flinched as if she had struck him. He nodded, unable to speak. Frank had talked about him. Of course he had. Frank talked about everyone. And Nick. Nick had let the calls go to voicemail. He had ignored the texts. He had let the guilt of his own survival, the suffocating fog of his PTSD, sever the one tie that had mattered. He had hidden from the world. He had hidden from Frank. And now, fate, in its cruel, precise, and terrible wisdom, had brought Frank's family, homeless and desperate, to his doorstep. "I looked for you." Nora's voice was suddenly thick with tears, not of sadness, but of a terrible, dawning comprehension. After he died, I tried to find the men he served with. I couldn't find you. You were just gone." "I've been here," Nick said, the words tasting like poison, hiding. The awkwardness of the morning, the tension of strangers in a confined space, evaporated. It was replaced by a crushing, shared history. The barriers were not just broken, they were annihilated. This was not a stranger. This was Nora, Frank's wife, and the little girl, Jessica, who was still standing by the doorway, her eyes wide, was Frank's daughter. The daughter he had shown Nick a picture of, a wrinkled, newborn photo, back in 2017. Nick looked at the little girl and his carefully constructed fortress. The walls he had spent 5 years building crumbled to dust. He had failed his friend in life, and until this exact moment, he had been failing him in death. Nora sank onto the small stool by the counter, her legs giving way. I don't understand. Of all the... how did you... The dog, Nick said, his voice flat. He looked at Diesel, who had watched the entire exchange with his intelligent, steady gaze. Diesel found you. As if summoned, Jessica, sensing the shift in the room's chaotic energy, slowly walked away from the wall. She approached the big shepherd, her small hand outstretched. Diesel leaned his head forward, letting her tiny fingers touch his soft ear. Nick and Nora just watched, two survivors of a shipwreck that had happened years apart, now stranded on the same small, impossible island. Nick opened his hand, staring at the dog tag, the small piece of metal that had just rewritten his entire world. The name hung in the small, sun-starved kitchen, heavy and real. Frank Reeves. For a long time, neither Nick nor Nora spoke. The only sound was the quiet click-click of Diesel's claws on the hardwood floor as he walked over and sat, with deliberate purpose, next to Jessica. The little girl, who had been watching the adults with wide, silent eyes, reached out a tiny, hesitant hand and buried it in the thick gray fur of the dog's ruff. Diesel did not flinch. He let out a low, content sigh. Nick's hand was still clenched around the dog tag, the metal biting into his skin. He finally uncurled his fingers and placed the tag on the counter, as if it were a heavy, fragile thing. Nora sank onto one of the kitchen stools, her legs unable to hold her. "He talked about you," she said, her voice a reedy whisper. "All the time. Lawson," he'd say, "grumpy, stubborn as a mule, but the only one I'd trust my back to. I feel like I've known you for years." Nick swallowed, the sound dry. He leaned against the counter, a mirror of her, the small kitchen space suddenly feeling like an interrogation room. He was a good man," Nick said. The words were inadequate. They were pebbles trying to fill a canyon. "He was," Nora agreed, a small, watery smile touching her lips for the first time. "He was loud, and he had the worst taste in music. He sang off-key in the shower every morning. I'd give anything to hear it one more time." The dam broke. The shared grief, a thing they had both been carrying alone, suddenly became a bridge. "The picture," Nick said, the memory surfacing with a sharp, painful clarity. "After Jessica was born, he must have showed me the photo 100 times. We were somewhere hot. He kept it in his helmet lining, pulled it out, all wrinkled and sweat-stained." Nick's voice was rough. He was so proud. He said he finally had something real to fight for. "Oh, Frank," Nora whispered, and now the tears came, not the panicked, frightened tears of the night before, but a slow, hot tide of pure sorrow. She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking. This Nick could handle. This was grief. Grief was an old, familiar enemy. He took a breath and did what he had done 100 times before. He made coffee. He moved with a quiet economy, rinsing the pot, scooping fresh grounds. The simple domestic sounds, the running water, the scrape of the scoop, filled the silence, giving Nora the space to cry. When she finally looked up, her eyes red-rimmed but clearer, he pushed a fresh, hot mug toward her. "How?" Nick asked, his voice low. "How did this happen, Nora? He was meticulous. He had plans for his plans. How did you end up at the Wayside Motel?" The question brought the shame crashing back. Nora's face, which had softened with memory, hardened again. She looked down into the black coffee. "He was," she said, her voice bitter. "He had everything planned, life insurance, a trust. He set it all up before his final deployment. He said, just in case. He said we would be taken care of. Jessica would be taken care of." "So what happened to it?" Nora's hand was shaking so badly she had to set the mug down. "Bruce Webb," she said, and the name was spoken like a curse. "Bruce Webb," she repeated. "Our lawyer. Frank knew him, or his family anyway. Webb was this respectable local figure, Chamber of Commerce. He sponsored the Little League team. He was safe." She laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. Frank made him the executor of the trust. For 2 years it was fine. After Frank died, it was exactly as he planned. The money was there, a monthly stipend. I paid the bills. I was putting a little aside for Jessica's college. She paused, taking a ragged breath. Then, about 6 months ago, Bruce called me in. He said the market was changing. He used a lot of big words. Restructuring. Aggressive new strategies. He said he could make the trust grow faster, that Frank's original plan was too conservative for the modern economy. You let him, Nick said. It was not a question. I trusted him. Nora's voice cracked, and she pounded a small, pale fist on the counter. He was Frank's choice. He was this kind, grandfatherly man. He'd pat Jessica on the head and tell me not to worry my pretty little head about boring finances. He said he would handle everything. He had me sign some papers. Just formalities, he said. She buried her face in her hands again. I'm so stupid. No, Nick said, his voice hard. You're not. It started a month ago. The stipend was late. I called. His secretary said he was in a meeting. Then my card was declined at the grocery store. I went to his office. He was different, cold. He said there had been a downturn, a bad investment. He said he was trying to recoup the losses. He told me to be patient and to cut back on expenses. We sold the car. We moved out of our apartment. We ended up at the Wayside Motel, paying week to week, while I tried to find a job that would cover anything. She looked up at Nick, her eyes hollow. Yesterday, the motel payment was due. I went to the ATM and the card just wouldn't work. The bank said the account was frozen. When I called Bruce's office, he was gone. On an extended vacation, his secretary said. Then she told me my file had been closed and hung up on me. I had $40 left, Nick. 40. Reed Porter. He didn't care. He just threw us out. I have failed my daughter. I have failed my husband. I let a monster steal my daughter's future. The confession was complete. It lay in the small kitchen, stark and ugly. Nick stood frozen, but this time it was not from panic. It was from a rage so cold and so pure it felt like ice in his veins. He had seen this before, not with lawyers and trust funds, but with men who preyed on the weak, who took advantage of loyalty and trust. This Bruce Webb, he was no different from the jackals Nick had fought overseas. He had just traded a rifle for a fountain pen. Nick looked past Nora into the living room. Jessica had fallen asleep, her small body curled against Diesel's warm gray and white flank. The big dog was awake, his gaze steady, watching the little girl as if she were his own. The sight broke something in Nick. The fog of his PTSD, the years of self-imposed isolation, the constant dull ache of his own guilt, it all vanished. It was replaced by a single, sharp, unyielding thought. This is Frank's family. This was not a stranger's problem. This was not a situation to avoid. This was a desecration. Frank Reeves had died serving his country, and while Nick had been hiding from the world had been busy tearing apart the one thing his friend had died to protect. He realized Nora was watching him, her face a mask of desperation, waiting for him to say something, to judge her, to pity her, to kick her out. Nick turned, not to her, but to the counter where his phone was charging. He unplugged it, his movements precise. What? What are you doing? Nora asked, her voice small. You said Frank's trust was meticulous. That means there's a paper trail, Nick said, his voice flat and devoid of all emotion. He was no longer the awkward, anxious recluse. He was someone else. Someone Nora had never met, but someone Frank would have recognized instantly. He scrolled through his contacts, a very short list, and pressed a name. He put the phone to his ear. It rang twice. Yeah, a gruff voice answered. Mitch, Nick said, it's Lawson. There was a pause. Then a sharp laugh on the other end. Lawson? Nick Lawson? I'll be damned. Thought you fell off the face of the earth, man. You still in Washington? I am, Nick said, cutting off the pleasantries. I need a favor." "A favor? From you?" The voice, belonging to a man named Mitchell, sobered. "Must be big. What is it? You in trouble?" "Not me," Nick said, his eyes locking with Nora's. "I need everything you have on a lawyer. A PI in Seattle should have connections." "A lawyer? That's it? Easy?" "His name is Bruce Webb. He operates out of this town. He just stole a trust fund. The whole thing." "Okay," Mitchell said, his voice all business now. "White-collar stuff can be tricky, Nick. Need more than just a name." "The trust," Nick said, his voice dropping, "belonged to Frank Reeves." The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. Mitchell had served with them. He knew the name. "Frank?" Mitchell's voice was different, harder. "You're sure?" "His wife and daughter are sitting in my kitchen, Mitch. They were homeless. He kicked them out of a motel." "The bastard," Mitchell's voice was a low growl. "Okay, Nick, this just became a pro bono case. Bruce Webb, you get me every piece of paper she has, every bank statement, every email, every scrap. I'll have his entire life on my desk by tomorrow. We're going to burn this guy to the ground." "Thank you, Mitch." "Don't thank me. Do it for Frank." The line clicked dead. Nick put the phone down on the counter. The war had begun. He looked at Nora. Her eyes were wide, a single tiny spark of hope trying to ignite in the ruins. "Okay," Nick said, the word a vow. "Let's see what you've got." The hours that followed the phone call were a blur of numb activity. Nora, her face pale but set with a fragile borrowed resolve, had retreated to the guest room. She emerged with a small, water-damaged manila folder, the only paperwork she had managed to grab. She and Nick sat at the small kitchen table, sorting through damp, curling bank statements and a thin copy of a will. Nick worked with a detached, cold efficiency. He scanned and photographed every page with his phone, sending the encrypted files to Mitchell. The process was sterile, methodical. It was a mission, and in missions he was comfortable. But now it was done. Nora had apologized, her voice a thread, saying she needed to check on Jessica, who had finally cried herself to sleep on the guest bed. The door to the hallway had clicked shut, leaving Nick alone in the sudden echoing silence of his own home. He stood on his small, covered back porch, which overlooked a rectangle of damp grass that passed for a yard. The air was cold, smelling of wet earth and the distant metallic tang of the Puget Sound. He held a mug of coffee he didn't want, the warmth doing nothing to penetrate the chill that had settled deep in his bones. He was drowning in it. Survivor's guilt. It was an old, familiar poison, one that Dr. King at the VA was always trying to treat with worksheets and breathing exercises. But the doctor didn't understand. Guilt was not an abstract concept. It was a physical weight. It was the dog tag sitting on his kitchen counter. Frank Reeves. Nick closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the rough siding of the house. He saw Frank's face, not as the hardened Marine, but as the new father, his face split by a grin of pure, terrified joy as he showed off that wrinkled photo. "You gotta be a godfather, Lawson. You're the grumpiest, most reliable bastard I know. You'll make sure she doesn't date till she's 30. Nick had laughed. He had promised. Of course, man, anything. A promise. A hollow word from a hollow man. After Nick had returned, not in a box, but in pieces, he had shut Frank out. He had shut everyone out. He remembered, with a clarity that felt like a hot spike in his chest, the phone calls. Frank's name flashing on the screen. He remembered the voicemails. "Hey, Lawson, it's me. Just checking in. Heard you're back stateside. Call me, man. Let's grab a beer. Mitch said you're not answering. Don't do this, Nick. Don't go dark on me. It's been 6 months. I get it. But Jessica asked about her Uncle Nick. Your call, man. I'm here." Nick had never called back. He had let the silence stretch, a festering wound, until Frank, too, was just a name on a memorial wall. He had been too busy drowning in his own darkness to see that his friend was still standing on the shore, his hand outstretched. And now, this. fate's cruelest joke. The one person he had failed in life, the one promise he had broken, had come back to haunt him in the most desperate way imaginable. His decision to call Mitchell hadn't been a choice. It was an obligation, a debt. He was doing this for Frank, to pay penance to a ghost. It was the cold calculus of duty, nothing more. A small sound, the creak of the back door, pulled him from his thoughts. Jessica stood in the doorway, a tiny, silent figure swallowed by his old olive drab t-shirt. Her eyes, the same clear blue as Frank's, were wide and red-rimmed. She was clutching the one-eared, still damp teddy bear. She did not look at Nick. Her gaze was fixed on the yard, where Diesel was lying on the wet grass, his gray and white body a stark contrast to the green. Diesel, who had been watching Nick with a handler's quiet concern, lifted his head, his ears pricked forward. He did not get up. Jessica took one tiny, hesitant step off the porch, her bare feet sinking into the cold, damp earth. "Hey," Nick said, his voice a low gravel, startling himself. "It's cold. You should—" She flinched, a full-body tremor, and stopped, her gaze snapping to the floor. Nick went silent, his words dying in his throat. He had spoken to her with the same tone he used for Diesel, a command, not a comfort. He watched, his gut twisting, as she stood frozen, a statue of fear, expecting a reprimand. Diesel saved them. The big shepherd let out a low, soft woof. It was not a bark, it was a sound of inquiry, a gentle cough of sound. He lowered his head onto his paws, his tail giving a single, slow, powerful thump against the ground. Jessica's head lifted. She looked at the dog. He was not looking at her, but at some distant point, as if he were just waiting. Slowly, as if pulled by an invisible string, the little girl walked across the grass. She stopped a few feet away from him, her small shoulders hitched up to her ears. Nick watched, his coffee forgotten. This was his dog, Diesel, a creature trained for war, just as he was. Diesel was a service animal, a living, breathing tool. He was trained to detect threats, to wake Nick from night terrors, to create a barrier in a crowded room. His very existence was a symbol of Nick's trauma, a four-legged reminder of the man he used to be and the damage that remained. Jessica sat down on the wet grass, her small legs crossed. She did not try to pet the dog. She just sat near him, her small fingers tracing patterns on the ground. Diesel, in turn, did not move. He was a creature of immense, contained power, a 100-pound shepherd bred for protection and aggression. And he was letting this fragile, terrified child sit in his space, his complete stillness, a form of acceptance. After a long minute, Jessica reached out a hand, her fingers barely trembling. She did not touch his head. She touched his tail, her fingers gently brushing the coarse fur at the very tip. Diesel's response was to let out a long, heavy sigh, a sound of profound contentment, and he closed his eyes. Nick felt something in his chest crack. He was watching a miracle. He was watching this innocent, shattered little girl, the daughter of the man he had failed, find her first moment of peace. She was finding it in the one thing that represented everything Nick had lost. She was finding comfort in his war. Diesel, his dog, his symbol of PTSD and survival and the horrors of the past, was, in this moment, nothing but a source of pure, unadulterated comfort. He was an anchor, not for Nick, for her. The realization struck Nick with the force of a physical blow. He had been wrong. This was not about duty. This was not about paying a debt to a ghost. Frank was gone. No amount of justice or vengeance could change that. This was about the living. It was about this little girl who was tracing patterns on his dog's tail as if he were the only solid thing left in her world. It was about Nora, who was in the other room, fighting for the scraps of a life that had been stolen from her. The protective instinct that Nick had buried under 5 years of guilt and self-loathing, the instinct he thought had died in the desert, suddenly, fiercely, roared to life. It was not a calculated decision, it was a primal shift. His motivation, which had been the cold, gray ash of obligation, ignited. This was no longer about Frank's past. This was about Jessica's future. He looked at the two of them in the yard, the child and the dog, a perfect, impossible picture of innocence and experience. They were not Frank's legacy, they were just a little girl and her mother. They were family. And Nick Lawson, for the first time in a very long time, knew exactly what he had to do. He was no longer just fulfilling a promise. He was going to protect his family. Mitchell's office in Seattle was a 40-mile drive and a different universe away from Nick Lawson's quiet, tense bungalow. It was on the third floor of an old brick building, smelled perpetually of stale coffee and rain-soaked carpet, and was piled high with the paper skeletons of other people's lives. Mitchell himself matched the decor. He was a man in his mid-40s, built like a fire hydrant, with a receding hairline he'd long given up on and the weary, cynical eyes of someone who got paid to believe the worst in people. He and Nick had come from the same forge, but where the fire had turned Nick brittle and sharp, it had beaten Mitchell into a dense, unmovable, and deeply stubborn object. He was staring at his monitor, his broad, strong fingers steepled, and he was profoundly annoyed. "Come on, Bruce," he muttered at the screen. "Nobody is this clean." He had spent the last 8 hours doing what he did best. He had run Bruce Webb through every digital database he paid for, and several he probably shouldn't have. He ran his name, his social security number, and his law practice. The results were infuriating. Bruce Webb was, on paper, a saint. His record with the Washington State Bar Association was immaculate, not just clean, lauded. A glowing review from 2019 for his pro bono work with local charities. His credit was a fortress. His business filings were perfect. He had no liens, no bankruptcies, no outstanding parking tickets. He was a pillar of his small industrial community. "This is a ghost," Mitchell growled, pushing back from his desk. The chair let out a long, painful groan. He stood and walked to the window, looking down at the Seattle street. Cars hissed by on the wet pavement. He trusted Nick's gut. More than that, he had trusted Frank Reeves's life. Frank was smart, meticulous. He wouldn't pick an idiot, and he wouldn't be fooled by a simple con. That meant Bruce Webb wasn't a simple con. He was a professional. He was the kind of predator who smiled, who brought casseroles to the wake, who knew every legal loophole and had used them to wallpaper his respectable, middle-class life. The legal doors were all closed and locked. Mitchell had hit a solid brick wall, which meant he had to go around. He picked up his phone, his thumb hovering over a name in his contacts. He hated this. He hated calling in favors. A favor was a debt, and he liked his ledger clean. But Nick's voice on the phone, that was the voice of a man who hadn't asked for help in a decade. And he'd asked for Frank. He sighed, the sound a gust of stale air, and hit the call button. It rang 3 times, and a sharp professional voice answered. "Financial Oversight, Monroe." "Steph, it's Mitch." There was a pause, and he could practically hear her posture change. "Mitch, this is my work number. This had better not be about your fantasy football league again, because I told you I cannot run analytics on running back injuries." A small smile tugged at Mitchell's mouth. "It's not. I need a look, off the record, deep off the record." The silence on the other end was cold. "Mitch," Stephanie Monroe said, her voice dropping to a low, serious tone. "You know what you're asking. I'm not a PI. I'm a state auditor. I look at things. I have to file a report. I start pulling files without cause. I get flagged. I lose a 30-year pension." "I know," Mitchell said, turning his back to the window. "I wouldn't ask, not for a normal case." "They're all not normal with you, Mitch." "This one's different," he said. "This one's for Frank Reeves." He heard a sharp intake of breath. Stephanie Monroe, a senior analyst who had seen every kind of fraud, had also been a military wife. Her husband had made it back. Frank hadn't. "Frank Reeves," she said, her voice soft. "Oh, Mitch, what's wrong?" "His widow, Nora, she's in a bad way. A lawyer named Bruce Webb, out of the town, north of here. He was the executor of Frank's trust. He just told her the money's all gone. Bad investments. Kicked her and her kid to the curb, literally. Webb, Stephanie repeated, and Mitchell could hear the faint, rapid sound of a keyboard tapping. 1B or 2? 2. Okay, she said. He's an investment manager as well as a lawyer. Licensed. No complaints. 0. His portfolio is boring, conservative. It doesn't make sense. That's the point, Mitchell said. He's a wolf, Steph. A clean one. I just need to know if he's done this before. I just need a place to dig. This woman, Nora, she has nothing. No paper trail. He holds all the cards. The keyboard tapping continued. He files quarterly as an LLC. It's all automated. I can't look at his active accounts without a warrant, Mitch. That's a felony. I don't need active. I need closed, Mitchell urged, his heart pounding. I need the ones that are already buried, the ones who didn't fight back. Another long silence, the sound of a mouse clicking. Mitch, Stephanie said, her voice barely a whisper. I am going to pull the general archives for closed trust accounts in that county, looking for high-loss flags from 2020 to 2024. That is a legitimate audit query. If I happen to see a name, and I happen to remember it, that's just a coincidence. You're a good woman, Stephanie Monroe. No, she said, her voice sharp. I'm a thorough employee, and I'm hanging up now. Don't call me about this again. Ever. The line went dead with a soft click. Mitchell spent the next 4 hours in a state of agitated limbo. He filed other reports, he made other calls, but his mind was on Webb. He was on his third cup of sludgy, bitter coffee when his phone buzzed. It was not a call. It was a secure, encrypted message from an app he and Stephanie used for emergencies. It contained no text, just 3 9-digit case file numbers. Mitchell's heart felt like it hit his shoes. He swiveled to his computer, his fingers flying. He pulled up the state's public court records, typing in the first number. Case 774-2021, estate of Michael T. Anderson. Beneficiary, Sarah Anderson, widow. Executor, Bruce Webb. The file was thin, a summary judgment. Trust assets, a significant life insurance payout, were moved into a high-risk tech fund. The fund collapsed. Total loss. Case closed. My God, Mitchell whispered. He typed in the second number. Case 109-2022. Estate of Robert Feldman. Beneficiary, Eleanor Feldman, widow. Executor, Bruce Webb. This one was different. A retirement fund. Moved into overseas commodities. The venture failed. Total loss. Case closed. His hands were shaking now. He typed in the third number. Case 642-2023. Estate of David Chen. Beneficiary, Maria Chen, widow. Executor, Bruce Webb. A pension, a 401k. All rolled into a venture capital real estate project. The project was fraudulent. The money was gone. Total loss. Case closed. 3 women, 3 widows, 3 lives systematically, efficiently, and legally hollowed out. It was a pattern. A sickening, predatory signature. Bruce Webb didn't target just anyone. He targeted the grieving. He targeted women who, like Nora, were too overwhelmed by the death of their partner to question the kind, grandfatherly man who was handling the boring finances. He isolated them, got their signatures, and then, in a clean legal stroke, he bled them dry, using high-risk funds as a paper-thin excuse. Nora wasn't his first victim. She was just the latest in a line. The rage that had been simmering in Nick's kitchen now had a name and a history. Mitchell's annoyance was gone, replaced by the same cold, sharp focus that had settled on Nick. He grabbed his phone. He didn't text. He called. Nick picked up on the first ring. Lawson. Nick, it's Mitch. He took a deep, steadying breath. It's worse than we thought. He's not just a thief. He's a serial predator. Serial predator. The words from Mitchell's end of the line landed in the small, quiet kitchen with the force of a physical impact. Nick's hand tightened on his phone, his knuckles turning white. He looked at Nora, who was watching him, her face a mask of fragile hope. He didn't need to repeat the words. She saw it in his eyes. "It's not just you," Nick said, his voice a low, cold monotone. "He's done this before, at least 3 other times. Same pattern. Widows?" Nora's legs gave out and she sank onto the stool, a small, wounded sound escaping her. It was a sound of profound validation and profound horror. "So I wasn't. Oh, those poor women." "Nick," Mitchell's voice crackled, pulling him back. "Listen to me. The pattern is good. It gives us leverage, but it's not a smoking gun. This guy is smart. He's used different excuses, different funds, covered his tracks legally. What he didn't count on was Frank's wife finding you. We need something he didn't know about. We need an original document, a contract, a letter, anything that contradicts the bad investment story." "Copies are all she has," Nick said, looking at the small, damp pile of papers on his table. "Copies aren't enough," Mitchell said, his voice grim. "We need something he didn't touch, something Frank kept. Keep looking, Nick. Call me the second you find anything." The line went dead. Nick put his phone down. The house, which had been a refuge, was now a staging ground. The nervous, awkward energy of the past day was gone, replaced by the sharp, metallic focus of a mission. "He said we need something original," Nick said. Nora looked up, her eyes no longer just filled with grief, but with a new, cold anger. "He took everything. When he had me sign those formalities, he had me bring in Frank's old files. He said he needed to consolidate them. He took the original trust agreement, the insurance policies. He said he'd keep them safe in his office vault." "He was hiding the evidence," Nick said. He looked at the red duffel bag, which was still in the entryway. "Is that everything?" "No," Nora said, standing up. "The rest it's still in your truck. The things Reed Porter threw out. The mattress. A box of kitchen things. It's all just junk." "It's not junk until we've cleared it," Nick said. He grabbed his keys. Together they walked out into the gray, flat light of the day. The air was cold. The bed of his pickup truck looked like a disaster. A small, child-sized mattress, stained and dark with rainwater. A cardboard box that had disintegrated, spilling cheap plates and mismatched silverware. And the black trash bags, ripped open, containing a life's worth in damp, useless clothing. It was a pathetic, heartbreaking sight. For a moment, Nick just stared. This was it. This was what was left of his friend's family. He didn't say a word. He just reached in and grabbed a corner of the wet mattress, hauling it out. Nora grabbed the other end. They carried it inside, water streaming from it, and dumped it unceremoniously in the middle of Nick's living room. His safe space was gone. He didn't care. Diesel, who had been lying in the hallway, lifted his head, his ears swiveling. He watched, sensing the shift in his handler from anxiety to pure, focused determination. They brought in the bags, the broken box. They piled it all in the center of the floor. Jessica peeked out from the guest room, her small face pale. "It's okay, honey," Nora said, her voice strained. "Mommy and Mr. Lawson are just looking for some papers." They began to tear through the bags. It was a grim, desperate search. Wet clothes, old shoes, a child's drawings, now just a mass of pulpy, ruined paper. Nora's hands were shaking as she unfolded damp shirts, checked pockets, her face growing more and more hopeless. "It's not here," she said, her voice breaking. "It's all just clothes. He has everything. He won. He has everything." "No," Nick said, his voice low. "Not everything." He was staring at the pile. Tucked beneath the mattress, half hidden by a sodden blanket, was a dark olive-green metal object. Nora followed his gaze. She went completely still. It was a small military-issue footlocker, standard. It was old, its reinforced metal edges scuffed and dented, the paint worn away in patches. "What's in that?" Nick asked, though he already knew. Nora's face, which had been set with anger, crumbled. The grief, raw and total, returned. I don't know," she whispered. It was a lie. Nora, what's in it? It was his, she said, her voice cracking. From Afghanistan. It's just his things. The things they sent back to me. She was looking at it as if it were a bomb. The flag from his service, his dress uniform, his medals, the letters I wrote to him. They were all returned to me. She put a hand to her mouth, stifling a sob. I've never opened it, Nick. I couldn't. I couldn't. Nick looked at the box, and his heart felt like it was being squeezed in a vice. This was not luggage. It was a time capsule. It was a tomb. For 2 years, this poor, broken woman had dragged this 60-pound anchor with her, from their apartment to a cheap motel, unable to face the finality of what was inside. Nora, Nick said, his voice softening, but firm. We have to look. You said it yourself. He never touched it. But it's just memories, she pleaded, tears streaming down her face. It's not papers. It's not legal. It's just Frank. That's exactly why we have to look, Nick said. It's the only thing Webb didn't control. It's the only place Frank could have kept something safe. She stared at the box for a long, agonizing moment. Then she gave a single, jerking nod. She was giving him permission to open a wound she had been too afraid to touch. Nick bent and pulled the heavy footlocker from the pile, dragging it into the center of the room. It made a scraping sound against the hardwood floor. He knelt beside it. It had 2 heavy metal latches on the sides, but the main fastener was in the center. It wasn't a padlock. It was an old-world non-regulation piece, a thick, heavy strap of dark leather riveted to the lid, which looped through a metal hasp on the base. It was secured with a complex, heavy-duty brass buckle. It was the kind of thing a man who was superstitious about losing keys might use. I don't know how, Nora began, her hands fluttering. Nick looked at the buckle. He'd seen this kind before. He began to work the stiff, cold leather strap. He was so focused on the mechanism, on the act of trespassing into his friend's final moments, that he didn't notice the change in the room at first. Diesel, who had been lying near the hallway, his head on his paws, suddenly stood up. The movement was silent but abrupt. Nick paused, his fingers on the brass. "What is it, buddy?" Diesel ignored him. He walked forward with a stiff, professional gait. His body was not aggressive, but every line of his powerful frame was rigid, with intense, focused curiosity. He stopped at the footlocker. Nora let out a small gasp. "What's he doing?" Diesel lowered his head. His black nose, a finely tuned instrument, began to twitch, his sniffing so intense it was almost silent. He sniffed the metal seam where the lid met the base. He sniffed the side latches. Then his entire focus narrowed. He pushed his nose hard against the central latch, not the brass buckle, but the old, dark, oil-stained leather strap that secured it. He inhaled, his sides expanding. He let out a low, almost inaudible whine, a sound of deep, confused recognition. "He smells something," Nick said, his own pulse suddenly hammering in his ears. Diesel did not back away. He pushed his nose into the leather again. Then, becoming more insistent, he lifted a heavy gray paw and scraped it down the front of the metal box. The sound was a sharp, grating screech of nail on painted steel. It was his alert signal. "He's alerting," Nick said, his voice sharp. He knew that smell. He could smell it from where he knelt. Faint, but unmistakable. It was the smell of old leather, brass polish, and gun oil. Diesel looked up, his pale, intelligent eyes locking with Nick's. Here. Nick's hands were no longer shaking. The hesitation was gone. The guilt was gone. He was on a mission. He turned his full attention back to the complex buckle. He had to get this box open. The scrape of Diesel's claw on the metal footlocker was a sharp, insistent demand. Here. Nick's focus, which had been on the complex brass buckle, narrowed. He looked at Diesel. The dog's pale, intelligent eyes were locked on his, unwavering. The animal was vibrating with a low, controlled energy. He was no longer just curious. He was working. "Okay," Nick breathed. "Okay, buddy, I see you." Nora was frozen, her hands at her mouth, watching the dog. She seemed to understand that this was no longer a random search. Nick's fingers, strong and practiced, finally worked the stiff, oiled leather strap free from the buckle. The tension released. He flicked open the two heavy side latches. A soft metallic clack-clack echoed in the quiet room. He paused, his hands on the lid. This felt like a violation. This was his friend's final, private space. "Nora?" he asked, his voice low. She gave a single, jerking nod, her eyes squeezed shut, bracing herself. Nick lifted the heavy lid. A groan of metal hinges. The air that escaped the footlocker was cold and still. It was the smell of memory. It smelled of camphor, of starched fabric, of brass polish, and faintly, undeniably, of the gun oil Diesel had alerted to. They both stared. On top, nestled in tissue paper that had yellowed at the edges, was a perfectly folded American flag. The triangle of stars was pristine. Nora let out a sound, a single sharp gasp of pain, as if she'd been struck. Her hand, trembling, reached out. She did not touch the flag. Her fingers hovered over the crisp blue fabric, a hairline away. "Oh, Frank," she whispered. The dam of her grief, which had been held back by anger and fear, broke again. Beneath the flag was Frank's dress uniform, the dark blue wool immaculate, a row of ribbons, a bright slash of color on the chest. Beside it, a velvet-lined box held his medals, polished and stark. These were the mementos. The sacred relics of a life cut short. Nick felt his throat tighten, a hard knot of shared grief. He, too, had a box like this, shoved in the back of his own closet, unopened since the day he received it. Nora finally, reverently, touched the sleeve of the uniform, her fingers tracing the gold stitching on the cuff. "He hated this thing," she said, a wet, broken laugh escaping her. "Said it was too stiff, too formal. He was a flannel shirt and jeans man, like you." Nick looked away, giving her the moment. His gaze fell to the rest of the contents. The box was compartmentalized. Beneath the uniform was a jumble of smaller things, photographs, a stack of letters tied with a ribbon, Nora's letters returned to sender, a challenge coin. And then he saw it. At the bottom, lying flat, was a thick, neat, official-looking manila folder, marked simply, "Personal." "That's it," Nick said, his voice sharp, pulling him from the grief and back to the mission. "That has to be it." His hand moved toward the folder, relief surging through him. This was the logical, obvious place for legal papers. Before his fingers could touch the cardboard, a gray and white head shot forward. Huff. Diesel pushed his nose directly into Nick's hand, blocking him. "Diesel, off!" Nick commanded, his voice sharp. The dog ignored him. He whined, a high, insistent sound of protest. He completely ignored the manila folder Nick was reaching for. Instead, he shoved his nose into the corner of the footlocker, his body rigid. "What is it?" Nora asked, startled. Tucked in the corner, almost hidden by the fabric lining, was another item. It was not a file. It was a small, unassuming book. It was an old-fashioned, leather-bound notebook, its dark brown cover worn smooth at the edges, the kind a man might keep in his pocket. It looked like a personal journal. Diesel pushed his nose against the leather cover, hard. Thump, thump, thump. He was striking it, his signal now impossible to ignore. He looked at Nick, his gaze intense. Not that one. This one. Nick stared, his mind catching up. The leather strap on the outside of the box had been oiled. Frank must have used the same oil to treat the cover of this specific notebook. The scent, the one Diesel had been trained on, the one he associated with his partner, it was all over this single, small object. Nick's training took over. Trust your partner. He looked at the manila folder, his logical human choice. Then he looked at the notebook, Diesel's choice. "Okay, buddy," Nick murmured. "You win. We'll check your book first." He slowly, reverently, lifted the small notebook from the box. It felt heavy in his hand, weighted with significance. Diesel immediately sat, the tension leaving his body, his tail thumping the floor once. His job was done. Nick opened the cover. The first page was just a scrawl. Frank's familiar, messy handwriting. If found, return to Frank Reeves. Or, if I'm dead, give this to Lawson. He'll know what to do. Nick's breath hitched. He closed his eyes for a second, the trust, the sudden, posthumous responsibility hitting him. What? Nora asked, leaning in. Nick just shook his head, unable to speak, and turned the page. The first few entries were from his deployment. Notes on patrol routes, names, things he wanted to remember. But then the entries changed. They were dated 2 years ago, just before his death. August 14th, 2023. Met with Bruce Webb today. Finalized the trust for Nora and Jess. He's pushing hard for a new investment strategy. Says my plan is too conservative. Nick's heart was hammering. He read on. September 1st, 2023. Told Webb no, absolutely not. The fund is for Nora and Jess, not for gambling. It stays in low-risk bonds. Ironclad. That's the whole point. Something about him, something feels off. He smiles too much. Told him to execute the original agreement. Final. Nick looked up at Nora. He knew, Nick whispered. He didn't trust him. But that's just a note, Nora said, her hope fading. It doesn't prove anything. Wait, Nick said. His fingers felt something thick, tucked into the back leather sleeve of the notebook. It was a set of papers, folded in thirds, held together by a single, slightly rusted paperclip. He pulled it out. He unfolded it. The header at the top was stark. Copy of Final Trust Agreement. Franklin M. Reeves. Nora, Nick said, his voice electric. The papers you signed. The ones Webb gave you. Do you have them? No, she said, her face pale. He kept them all. He said it was for the file. Think. Did you take a picture? Anything? She fumbled for her phone, the one with the cracked screen she'd charged in the guest room. I did, when he was explaining the new strategy. He showed me the main page, the one about the investments. I took a picture. I wanted to try and understand it later. I felt so stupid. Her fingers were shaking as she tapped the screen. Here, it's blurry, but... She held the phone out. Nick held the original paper from the notebook next to it. They were not the same. The original document, the one Frank had written about in his journal, was clear. All assets shall be invested only in federally insured, low-risk, A-rated bonds and annuities. The document on Nora's phone, the one Webb had her sign, was a wall of legal text. But the paragraph was different. Tamarba, executor is granted full and total discretion to manage assets, including but not limited to investment in high-risk, non-insured venture capital, commodities, and overseas real estate projects. It was a license to steal. He didn't make a bad investment, Nora, Nick said, his voice a low, cold growl. He changed the contract. He waited until Frank was gone, and then he swapped the real document with a fake one and had you sign it. The notebook held Frank's suspicions, and the paperclip held the proof. Nora just stared, her mind unable to process the sheer cold-blooded malice of it. He knew, she whispered, looking at the notebook. Frank knew, and he left this for me. No, Nick said, his gaze falling on Diesel, who was now resting his head on Jessica's small sleeping form. He left this for us. He knew I'd trust the dog. Nick stood up, the original contract in one hand, Frank's journal in the other. He pulled out his phone. He hit Mitchell's number. Mitch, Nick said, his voice hard as steel. I've got it. We're going to burn him to the ground. The phone call ended, but the silence that filled Nick Lawson's small house was no longer empty. It was charged with a cold, electric purpose. The war had a target. The mission was clear. What? Nora whispered, her eyes fixed on the evidence spread across the floor. What happens now? Nick was already moving. He scooped the original contract and Frank's leather-bound journal into the manila folder he had retrieved from the footlocker. He grabbed his keys, the flannel shirt he had worn for 2 days, and his jacket. "Now," Nick said, his voice flat, "I end this." You're leaving?" He looked at her, then at Jessica, who was now awake and watching him with wide, solemn eyes. "I'm driving to Seattle. Mitchell is meeting me. This," he tapped the folder, "can't be a text message. It has to be physical." He paused, his hand on the doorknob. He looked at Diesel. The big shepherd was already at his side, his body alert, ready. "Stay here. Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone but me." "Nick." Nora's voice was small. "Thank you." He just nodded. "Lock the door." He and Diesel were in the truck and disappearing into the gray pre-dawn light before she could say another word. The drive to Seattle was a 90-minute corridor of steel gray sky and wet asphalt. Nick didn't hear the radio. He didn't feel the stiffness in his back. He was in the zone, a place of cold, clear focus he hadn't inhabited since his discharge. All the static, all the anxiety, all the ghosts that haunted his daily life were gone, burned away by the clean, sharp blade of this single objective. Diesel sat in the passenger seat, a silent, solid partner. His presence was not a comfort. It was a mirror of Nick's own focus. They met Mitchell at a small 24-hour coffee shop that smelled like burnt beans and old grease. Mitchell was already in a booth, a stack of files in front of him. He looked like he hadn't slept, his eyes red-rimmed. "You look like hell, Lawson," Mitchell grunted, taking the folder from Nick. "You too," Nick said, sliding into the booth. Diesel lay at his feet, his head resting on Nick's boot, his eyes scanning the diner. As Mitchell opened the notebook, a third person approached the table. She was a woman in her late 30s, her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun. She wore a perfectly tailored gray suit, and her eyes, behind a pair of sharp rectangular glasses, were the color of cold steel. "This is her," Mitchell said. "Harper Blake." Harper looked at Nick, then at Diesel, and her expression, which had been all business, softened for a barest fraction of a second. She held out her hand. "Mr. Lawson, Harper Blake, I'm part of the Veterans Legal Network. Mitch called me." Her handshake was firm, her hand surprisingly warm. "He told me what you have. May I?" Nick nodded. Harper sat, and for the next 20 minutes, she read. She read Frank's journal entries. She read the original contract. She read the text messages Nora had forwarded to Nick, showing the blurry forged contract. Then she read Mitchell's files on the 3 other widows. When she was done, she closed the last file, her movements precise. She took off her glasses and cleaned them, a deliberate, cold motion. "Mr. Webb," she said, her voice quiet but lethal, "is not just a thief. He is a ghoul. He preys on grief." "So we can sue him," Nick said. "Suing takes years," Harper said, putting her glasses back on. "He'd drain the accounts, declare bankruptcy, and be on a beach in a non-extradition country before we saw a courtroom. We are not just suing him." She tapped the stack of files. "Mitch, your pattern evidence is solid. Nick, this notebook and the original contract are the murder weapon. The forgery is the confession. I just left the courthouse. I filed an emergency motion with Judge Allister, he's an old Marine, citing predicate acts of racketeering and fraud targeting a protected class, which includes surviving military spouses. He signed the writ an hour ago." "What does that mean?" Nick asked. "It means," Mitchell said, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face, "that we just froze him. Every account, every asset, his office, his home, his boat, his offshore holdings. He can't move a dime. He can't run." "Today," Harper said, standing up, "we are not lawyers. We are process servers. We are going to drive to his office, and I am going to personally hand him the injunction." She looked at Nick. "He will be angry. He will be arrogant. And then he will be ruined. Are you ready?" Nick stood. He looked at Diesel. "We are." Bruce Webb's office was on the idyllic, tree-lined main street of the town. It was in a restored brick building with a polished brass plaque that read, Webb & Associates, Estate Law. It was the very picture of small-town integrity. The receptionist, a polite woman in her 60s, looked up as the three of them and a 100-pound German shepherd entered. The bell above the door chimed, a soft, pleasant sound. "May I help you?" she asked, her smile faltering as she looked at Diesel. "We're here to see Mr. Webb," Harper said, her voice pleasant. "We don't have an appointment, but he will absolutely want to see us." "I'm sorry, he's with a client." "He'll see us now," Harper said, not rude, but with a finality that made the woman flinch. She walked past the desk, down the short, carpeted hallway. Nick, Mitchell, and Diesel followed, a silent, grim procession. Harper pushed open the heavy oak door to Webb's office. Bruce Webb was exactly as Nora had described. He was in his late 60s with a full head of silver hair, a kind, grandfatherly face, and a smart blue cardigan. He was on the phone laughing, his feet up on his massive mahogany desk. He looked up, his smile vanishing, replaced by confusion, then irritation. "I'm sorry," he said, holding a hand over the phone's receiver. "You'll have to go back to the—" He stopped. He was looking at Nick. He was looking at Diesel. The dog's presence, silent and massive, seemed to suck the air out of the room. "I'll call you back," Webb said into the phone, his voice suddenly flat. He hung up. "This is a private office," Webb said, his folksy charm returning, but his eyes were hard. "I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to leave, especially," he gestured at Diesel. "With that, this isn't a park." "Mr. Webb," Harper Blake began, her voice crisp. "My name is Harper Blake. I am an attorney. This is Mitchell, an investigator. And this is Nicholas Lawson." "Lawson," Webb repeated, testing the name. He didn't know it. "And? What is this about?" "This," Harper said, "is about Nora Reeves." Webb's face, which had been a mask of polite irritation, instantly settled. He became the concerned professional. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Ah, Mrs. Reeves, a truly tragic situation. I have done my best to advise her, but her investments, frankly, they were poorly managed before I took over, and then the market downturn." He shook his head, a perfect performance of sympathetic regret. "I am afraid her financial situation is dire, but that is a confidential matter, and I must ask you to—" "How about Sarah Anderson?" Mitchell interrupted, his voice a low growl. Webb's eyes snapped to him. "Or Eleanor Feldman? Or Maria Chen?" Mitchell continued, stepping forward. "Their situations were dire, too, weren't they? All widows, all recent, all unfortunate downturns. You have a very specific, very tragic business model, don't you, Bruce?" The color drained from Bruce Webb's face. The grandfather was gone. "I have no idea what you're talking about," he said, his voice a cold hiss. "This is slander. I will have your licenses. Get out of my office, now." "We're not done," Harper said. She stepped up to the desk. She placed a single, blurry photograph on his pristine desk blotter. "This is the forgery you had Nora Reeves sign, the one that gave you full discretion to gamble her husband's money." Webb stared at it. He was breathing heavily. This is inadmissible. This is a misunderstanding." "And this," Harper said, her voice dropping, "is the original." She placed Frank Reeves' original paper-clipped contract next to the photo. The sound of the paper hitting the desk was quiet, but it was the sound of a guillotine blade falling. Webb looked at the original contract. He looked at the signature. He looked at the low-risk investment clauses. He looked at it as if he were seeing a ghost. "Where?" he whispered, his arrogance shattered, replaced by a raw, naked panic. "Where did you get that?" Nick Lawson, who had been silent by the door, his hand resting on Diesel's head, finally spoke. "He kept it," Nick said, his voice a low, gravelly sound that filled the room. He stepped forward and, with a single, deliberate motion, placed Frank's worn, leather-bound notebook on the desk. Webb looked at the notebook. He looked at Nick. He looked at the massive, silent dog at his side. "Frank didn't trust you," Nick said. That was it. That was the final blow. Bruce Webb did not shout. He did not deny it. He looked at the journal, at the contract, at the angry, righteous faces in front of him, and he simply broke. The man who had built an empire on false sympathy and legal thievery collapsed. He fell back into his high-backed leather chair, his body slumping, his face the color of wet ash. He was a puppet with its strings cut. "Oh no," he whimpered. "Oh no." The door to the office opened again. 2 uniformed police officers stepped inside. "Mr. Webb," the lead officer said, his voice calm, "I have a warrant for your arrest." As the officers moved forward, pulling the shaking, whimpering man from his chair, Nick Lawson turned. He didn't watch the arrest. He put his hand on Diesel's neck. "Let's go home, buddy," he said. He, Harper, and Mitchell walked out of the office, past the stunned, crying receptionist, and into the clean, cold Washington air, leaving the wreckage of Bruce Webb's life behind. The drive back from Seattle was the quietest 90 minutes of Nick Lawson's life. It was a different kind of quiet from the one he had so desperately curated in his empty house. That had been a brittle, fragile silence, a defense against the world. This was the quiet of a mission complete. It was the silence of a great weight lifted. Diesel, in the passenger seat, was not on alert. He was not working. He was asleep, his head resting on the center console, a low, soft snore rumbling from his deep chest. He was just a dog, tired after a long day. Nick drove, his hands steady on the wheel. He watched the familiar, rain-slicked landscape of his town roll by, but he was seeing it for the first time. The fog in his own head, the persistent, low-grade static of his past, had receded. It was as if he had been living his life underwater, and he had finally, blessedly, broken the surface. When he pulled into his driveway, the porch light was on, cutting a warm, yellow square into the twilight. He walked up the steps, his boots heavy. He heard the sound of the deadbolt sliding back before he could even put his key in the lock. The door opened. Nora stood there, her face pale, her eyes wide with 1,000 unspoken questions. Jessica was hiding behind her legs, peeking out. Nick looked at her, and for the first time, he didn't feel the intrusion. He didn't feel the anxiety of his space being invaded. He just felt home. "It's done," he said, his voice quiet. "Bruce Webb is under arrest. It's over." For a long moment, Nora did not move. She just stared at him, her mind struggling to comprehend the words. "Over," she whispered. "Over," he confirmed. "Harper Blake, the lawyer. She has it all. The original contract, the journal, Mitchell's evidence. It's done, Nora." The woman who had stood rigid against the storm, who had held herself together with pure, desperate will, finally broke. She didn't scream. She didn't wail. A low sound, a single shuddering sigh of profound, agonizing relief escaped her. Her legs buckled, and she slid down the wall, her hands covering her face as 2 years of terror, guilt, and grief came pouring out in a flood of silent, cleansing tears. Nick stepped inside and shut the door. He didn't know what to do. He was a soldier, not a comforter. But Diesel knew. The big shepherd, awake now, walked past Nick. He went straight to the crying woman, his claws clicking softly on the floor. He didn't nudge her. He didn't whine. He simply laid his heavy, warm head in her lap. Nora's hands, shaking, left her face and buried themselves in his thick, gray fur. She hugged the big dog, her sobs muffling into his shoulder. Jessica, seeing her mother cry, took a hesitant step forward. She looked at her mom, then at the dog, then at Nick. Nick knelt, his bad knee protesting. He was on her level. "It's okay," he said, his voice rough. "Your mom's okay. Everything is going to be okay now." The little girl looked at him, her blue eyes, Frank's eyes, searching his. Then, in a small, brave motion, she stepped forward and wrapped her tiny arms around Nick's neck. It was a simple, trusting hug, and it healed him. Nick's arms, stiff and awkward, came up and held the small, warm child. He held her as he had held his rifle, as he had held his guilt. But this was a different kind of weight. This was the weight of a promise, finally kept. 2 months passed. The Pacific Northwest winter had settled in, but the relentless rain had given way to days of sharp, cold, brilliant sunshine. Bruce Webb was prosecuted to the full extent of the law. As Harper Blake had predicted, the combination of Frank's journal, the forged contract, and the pattern of predation on the other widows was an ironclad case. The state froze every domestic asset he had: his house, his office, his boat, his accounts. It would take years, Harper explained to Nick over the phone, to untangle the offshore accounts, but the immediate victory was total. The Victims' Compensation Fund just approved the emergency payout, Harper's crisp voice said. It's not everything, not yet, but it's significant. It's enough for Nora Reeves and the other victims to start over. She should see the first check by Friday. It was enough. It was more than enough. The new apartment was small. It was a 2-bedroom unit on the ground floor of a modest, clean complex on the other side of town. It had beige carpets and white walls, but it was warm, it was safe, and it was theirs. The most important part was the small, sliding glass door in the living room that opened onto a tiny, fenced-in patch of grass. Nick sat on the small concrete patio, a mug of coffee, this one given to him by Nora, warming his hands. He was wearing his flannel shirt, but he was at ease, his shoulders relaxed. He was not a guest. He was not an intruder. He was just visiting. The sound of a high-pitched, delighted squeal filled the air. I got it, Diesel!" Jessica, now a different child entirely, was running across the small yard. Her hair, which had been lank and tangled, was clean and tied back in a ponytail. She was wearing bright pink sneakers that squeaked on the damp grass. She was holding a bright red, durable plastic disc. Diesel, the gray and white hero, was in a playbow, his front legs splayed, his back end wagging his entire body, his tail a blur. A low, happy bark rumbled in his chest, a sound of pure joy. "Okay, boy, get it," Jessica shrieked, and she threw the disc with all her 5-year-old might. It wobbled, flying a good 10 feet. Diesel was a streak of gray lightning. He snatched it out of the air, his movements fluid and powerful. He landed, spun around, and trotted back to her, his head held high, the disc in his mouth. He dropped it at her feet, nudged her hand with his nose, and then bounced back, ready for the next throw. He was not a service dog. He was not a soldier. He was a dog, playing with his girl. Nora came out, holding a plate of cookies. She looked years younger. The hollow, haunted look in her eyes was gone, replaced by a light Nick had never seen there. She was, he realized, beautiful. "More coffee?" she asked, smiling. "I'm good," Nick said, smiling back. He watched the scene in the yard, the child laughing, the dog playing. He thought of Frank, the man who had shown him a wrinkled photo in the desert heat, the man who had trusted him. The crushing weight of guilt was gone. In its place was a quiet, profound peace. He had done right by his friend. He had found a family. Nick Lawson looked at the man he had been just 2 months ago, a ghost hiding from the world in a house full of shadows. And he looked at himself now, sitting in the sun, listening to a child's laughter. The war was finally over. He was home. The story of Nick, Nora, and Diesel reminds us that we are never truly lost. Even in the darkest of storms, the unwavering loyalty of a single, brave heart, whether it belongs to a fellow soldier or a devoted animal, can be the anchor that guides us back to shore. If this journey of healing and justice touched your heart, we hope you will join our community by subscribing, as your support allows us to tell these stories. We would be honored to read your thoughts about Diesel's promise in the comments below. Please consider sharing this message with someone who may need it. The next tale is already waiting for you, right here on the screen.